Have you ever witnessed a moment so brutally unfair that your blood boiled, only to watch karma deliver a blow so devastating it leaves you breathless? Picture a luxurious first-class cabin, preparing for a transatlantic flight. A wealthy, entitled tech CEO decides the quiet black woman sitting across the aisle doesn't belong among the elite. He hurls insults, threatens the flight crew's jobs, and demands her immediate removal, certain he holds all the power in the world. But he made one fatal, life-destroying mistake. He didn't know who she really was. Stick around for this unbelievable story, because the twist will drop your jaw, and the revenge is absolute perfection. The sprawling glass windows of JFK International Airport's Terminal 4 offered a sweeping view of the tarmac, but Dr. Josephine Caldwell wasn't looking at the planes. She was staring blankly at the dark screen of her tablet, fighting off a wave of utter exhaustion. At 42, Josephine was one of the premier pediatric neurosurgeons on the East Coast, and she had just wrapped up an agonizing, high-stakes 14-hour surgery. She was exhausted down to her marrow. For her flight to London, a strictly business trip to finalize an international medical partnership, she had forgone her usual tailored suits. Instead, she wore a simple, oversized charcoal cashmere hoodie, dark leggings, and a pair of worn-in running shoes. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun. She looked comfortable, unassuming, and entirely invisible, which was exactly what she wanted. She sat quietly in the corner of the Oceanic Airlines first-class lounge, sipping an overpriced sparkling water. A few seats away, shattering the quiet ambiance of the lounge, stood Richard Sterling. Richard was the CEO of Sterling Logistics, a mid-sized but highly profitable supply chain management firm. He was 50-something, dressed in a sharp, bespoke navy suit, and pacing like a caged tiger while barking aggressively into his smartphone. "I don't care what the vendor says, Chloe. You tell them if the shipment isn't docked by Tuesday, I'll personally bankrupt their entire operation. Do you understand me? I don't pay you to give me excuses." Richard snapped, rolling his eyes as he took a sip of a mimosa. He snapped his fingers loudly at a passing lounge attendant, pointing to his empty glass without even making eye contact, expecting an immediate refill. Josephine watched him for a brief second over the rim of her glass. She had dealt with men like Richard her entire life. Men who took up all the oxygen in the room and believed their wealth bought them the right to treat the world as their personal footstool. She sighed softly and looked away, eager to just board the plane and sleep for 7 hours. Suddenly, the overhead speaker chimed. "Oceanic Airlines announces priority boarding for Flight 408 to London Heathrow. We invite our first-class passengers and Oceanic Diamond Elite members to board at Gate B12 at this time." Josephine gathered her leather tote bag and made her way toward the gate, relishing the thought of the lie-flat pod awaiting her in Seat 1A. As she approached the designated first-class boarding lane, she felt a heavy shoulder shove past her. "Excuse me," a sharp, condescending voice barked. It was Richard. He had practically sprinted from the lounge to ensure he was the first to board. He looked Josephine up and down, his eyes lingering on her hoodie and sneakers, a sneer forming on his lips. "The main cabin boarding doesn't start for another 30 minutes, Richard said, his tone dripping with patronizing faux helpfulness. "This line is for first class. You're in the wrong place." Josephine blinked, keeping her face perfectly neutral. "I'm in the right place, thank you," she replied quietly, stepping forward to hand her digital boarding pass to the gate agent. Richard scoffed loudly, stepping uncomfortably close to her. "Look, they don't do those cheap upgrades at the gate anymore. Don't hold up the line for the people who actually paid to be here." He turned to the gate agent, a young man named Tyler. "Are you going to check her ticket, or are we just letting anybody clog up the priority lane today?" Tyler looked flustered but smiled politely at Josephine. He scanned her phone. The machine flashed a bright, validating green light. "Welcome back, Dr. Caldwell." "Have a wonderful flight," Tyler said, deliberately emphasizing her title. Richard's face twitched. He huffed a breath of pure annoyance, muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like diversity quotas, and aggressively shoved his own phone onto the scanner. Josephine didn't look back. She simply walked down the jet bridge, a cold, calm resolve settling over her. She was too tired for a fight, but she wasn't someone who backed down easily. Oceanic Airlines' first-class cabin, on their Boeing 777, was a masterclass in modern aviation luxury. There were only 8 suites, each featuring closing doors, a personal wardrobe, and a seat that converted into a plush bed. Josephine immediately found her suite, 1A, situated by the window in the very front row. She stored her tote bag in the overhead bin, settled into the wide leather seat, and closed her eyes, letting the ambient boarding music wash over her. Less than a minute later, heavy footsteps stomped down the aisle. "You have got to be kidding me," a booming voice echoed through the quiet cabin. Josephine opened one eye. Richard Sterling was standing in the aisle, staring at his boarding pass and then glaring at the suite directly across the aisle from hers, Suite 1B. Because of the cabin layout, seats 1A and 1B were slightly angled toward each other, meaning they would be in each other's peripheral vision for the duration of the flight unless they kept their suite doors shut. Richard slammed his expensive leather briefcase into the overhead bin with unnecessary force. He then turned and glared directly at Josephine, who was calmly sipping a glass of pre-departure champagne offered by the flight attendant. "Excuse me, miss," Richard barked, raising his hand to snap his fingers. Samantha Higgins, the lead purser for the flight, hurried over. Samantha was a veteran flight attendant with 20 years of experience, known for her impeccable professionalism and ironclad patience. "Yes, sir. Welcome aboard. How can I assist you?" "There has been a massive error," Richard said, pointing a finger sharply at Josephine. "I specifically booked a suite where I wouldn't be disturbed. I paid over $14,000 for this ticket. I am trying to conduct serious business on this flight, and I expect a certain caliber of environment." Samantha looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir. Is there an issue with your suite?" "The issue is my seating assignment." Richard lowered his voice, but not enough to prevent Josephine from hearing every venomous word. "I don't know how she got in here, whether she used thousands of stolen air miles or got some charity upgrade, but I am not sitting across from her. Look at her. She looks like a vagrant off the street. She doesn't belong here." Samantha's professional smile instantly hardened. "Sir, please lower your voice. Every passenger in this cabin is ticketed and belongs here. Seat 1A is assigned to that passenger." "I don't care what the computer says," Richard growled, leaning closer to Samantha. "People like her ruin the brand. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The loud music, the attitude. I'm not dealing with it. Move her to the back. Put her in premium economy. I'm sure that's a massive step up for her anyway." Josephine sat perfectly still. Her heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She took another elegant sip of her champagne, her dark eyes locking onto Richard's flushed, angry face. She had spent years working twice as hard to get half the respect in the medical field. She had endured the insidious whispers and the blatant disrespect from colleagues and patients alike. But Richard's overt, unvarnished racism in the middle of a luxury aircraft was a new level of audacity. "I cannot and will not move another passenger, sir," Samantha said, her tone dropping its customer service cadence and adopting a firm, authoritative edge. "If you are unhappy with your assigned seat, you are welcome to speak to the gate agent about taking a later flight. Otherwise, I must ask you to take your seat so we can complete boarding." "Do you know who I am?" Richard hissed, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. "My name is Richard Sterling. Sterling Logistics. We handle a massive portion of Oceanic Airlines ground freight. I spend millions with this airline. You are a glorified waitress in the sky. I demand you move her, or I will have your job before we even cross the Atlantic." Josephine slowly set her champagne flute down on her side console. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward. The trap was set. All Richard had to do was take one more step into it. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. The other few passengers who had boarded were peeking over their privacy dividers, watching the spectacle with a mix of horror and fascination. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out in a display of aggressive, toxic dominance. He physically blocked the aisle, refusing to let the boarding process continue. "I am not sitting down until she has moved," Richard declared loudly, abandoning any pretense of an inside voice. "I will not be subjected to forced diversity initiatives on a flight I paid a premium for. It's unsafe, it's unacceptable, and I demand to speak to the captain right now." Samantha held her ground, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "Sir, making racist remarks and threatening the crew is a violation of federal aviation regulations. You need to calm down and take your seat, or I will be forced to have security remove you from this aircraft." "Remove me?" Richard laughed hysterically. You're going to remove a Diamond Elite corporate partner to protect a woman in sweatpants? Call the captain. Now, let's see whose side he takes. Samantha gave him a cold, hard glare, then picked up the interphone and dialed the flight deck. She spoke in hushed, urgent tones. A minute later, the reinforced cockpit door clicked open, and Captain David Montgomery stepped out. Captain Montgomery was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a stern, no-nonsense demeanor. "What seems to be the problem here, Samantha?" the captain asked, stepping into the first-class cabin. Before Samantha could explain, Richard launched himself forward, plastering a slimy, conspiratorial smile on his face. "Captain, thank God. Richard Sterling, Sterling Logistics. Good to meet you. Your purser here is being incredibly uncooperative. I simply pointed out that there has been a ticketing error with this passenger." He gestured dismissively toward Josephine. "She's clearly out of her element, making me uncomfortable. And given the state of the world, I don't feel safe flying next to someone who clearly doesn't fit the security profile of a premium cabin. I'm just asking for her to be relocated." Captain Montgomery looked at Richard, then slowly turned his gaze towards Suite 1A. When he saw who was sitting there, his eyes widened slightly, a flash of pure shock crossing his features before he instantly masked it. "Mr. Sterling," the captain began, his voice dangerously low. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly. You are refusing to take your seat, holding up the departure of my aircraft, and demanding I remove a ticketed passenger because you don't like how she looks?" "I'm looking out for the integrity of your airline, Captain," Richard said arrogantly, adjusting his tie. "You know as well as I do that she didn't buy that ticket. She's a security risk. If she stays, I'm calling the CEO of Oceanic Airlines directly. We play golf at the same country club. I will have your wings, and I will have this flight attendant fired." Silence fell over the cabin. The soft hum of the plane's auxiliary power unit was the only sound. Then, Josephine Caldwell finally spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was calm, measured, and possessed the kind of quiet, absolute authority that commanded instant silence. "Are you quite finished, Mr. Sterling?" Richard snapped his head toward her, his lip curling. "Excuse me? You don't speak to me." Josephine stood up from her seat. Even in her cashmere hoodie and sneakers, she projected an aura of absolute dominance. She stepped out of her suite and stood in the aisle, face to face with Richard. "I asked if you were finished," Josephine repeated, her eyes locking onto his with chilling intensity. "Because if you are done throwing your temper tantrum, I have a few things I would like to clarify for you." Richard sneered. "I don't care what you have to say." "Captain, remove her." Captain Montgomery didn't move an inch. He just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at Richard with what could only be described as pity. "Captain Montgomery," Josephine said, not breaking eye contact with Richard, "would you please inform Mr. Sterling of the exact nature of the error regarding my presence on this flight?" The captain cleared his throat, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "Of course. Mr. Sterling, you are absolutely right about one thing. There was an error made today, but it wasn't regarding her ticket. It was regarding who you decided to insult." Richard frowned, confusion briefly breaking through his rage. "What are you talking about?" Josephine reached into her tote bag and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing a solid platinum identification card bearing the Oceanic Airlines crest. "My name is Dr. Josephine Caldwell," she said, her voice echoing clearly through the hushed cabin. "I am a pediatric neurosurgeon, but more relevant to you, Mr. Sterling, I am the majority shareholder of Oceanic Airlines and the vice chairwoman of the board of directors. I own the plane you are standing on, and you have exactly 30 seconds to get off my aircraft before I have you arrested for trespassing." For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the first-class cabin was the soft, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning vents. Richard Sterling stood frozen in the aisle, the color draining so rapidly from his face that he looked as though he might physically collapse. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled from the water. He stared at the platinum identification card in Josephine's hand. The Oceanic Airlines crest gleamed under the overhead reading lights. Below the crest, the words Board of Directors, Vice Chairwoman were etched in unmistakable, bold lettering. "That's..." Richard stammered, his previous bravado evaporating into thin air. That's a fake. You expect me to believe you own the airline? You're wearing sweatpants. Captain Montgomery stepped squarely between Richard and Josephine. The polite, customer service veneer was entirely gone from his expression. Mr. Sterling, you are addressing Dr. Caldwell. And yes, she is exactly who she says she is. Now, you have been given a direct order by the owner of this aircraft to disembark. Grab your briefcase. Panic, hot and sour, finally flooded Richard's system. He looked wildly at Samantha, the flight attendant he had just threatened to fire. She was standing tall, a look of profound, icy satisfaction settling onto her features. He looked at the other passengers, a wealthy couple in Suite 2A and an older gentleman in 2B, all of whom were staring at him with undisguised disgust. Wait, let's just take a breath. Richard sputtered, his hands trembling as he reached up to loosen his silk tie. The oppressive heat of his own humiliation was suffocating him. Dr. Caldwell, I apologize. I was out of line. I've been under a tremendous amount of stress with the supply chain disruptions. My vendor in Singapore. I am not your therapist, Mr. Sterling, Josephine interrupted smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. And I have zero interest in your supply chain. What I am interested in is the safety and dignity of my crew and my passengers. You demonstrated a shocking lack of respect for both. You made assumptions based on the color of my skin and the clothes on my back, and you used your perceived wealth as a weapon to bully a woman simply doing her job. Josephine nodded toward Samantha. Miss Higgins is a 20-year veteran of Oceanic Airlines. She is family. You do not threaten my family. I'll buy her a first-class ticket anywhere she wants to go. I'll double whatever bonus she gets this year, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking. He was sweating profusely now, the bespoke navy suit suddenly looking disheveled and pathetic. Please, if I don't make this meeting in London, my company stands to lose a massive contract. Just let me sit down. I won't say another word. Captain, Josephine said, completely ignoring Richard's groveling. Call Port Authority police. I want him escorted off. Already done, Doctor, Captain Montgomery replied softly. Almost on cue, heavy boots echoed down the jet bridge. Two armed Port Authority officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davies, stepped onto the aircraft, their expressions strictly business. Captain, we got a call about a disruptive passenger? Officer Miller asked, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Captain Montgomery pointed directly at Richard. This man is trespassing. He has been asked to leave by the owner of the airline and is refusing. He also verbally assaulted my lead purser. Hold on, I'm a Diamond Elite member, Richard yelled, his panic turning back into desperate anger as Officer Miller approached him. You can't do this to me. I generate millions for this airline. Do you know who I am? Sir, I need you to step forward and place your hands behind your back, Officer Davies instructed, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. I am not putting those on. I will walk off myself, Richard shrieked, struggling as Officer Miller firmly grasped his left arm. You lost the privilege of walking off yourself when you refused a direct order to disembark, sir. Stop resisting, Miller warned. With a swift, practiced motion, the officers secured Richard's wrists behind his back. The sharp click-click-click of the handcuffs locking echoed loudly in the small cabin. It was the sound of complete, undeniable defeat. As they turned him around to face the door, Richard locked eyes with Josephine one last time. She was already sitting back down in her suite, calmly picking up her glass of champagne. You're making a huge mistake, Richard screamed as the officers dragged him toward the exit. Sterling Logistics handles all your ground freight. I will pull our contract. I will bankrupt your cargo division. You hear me? Goodbye, Mr. Sterling, Josephine said, not even looking up. The officers marched Richard out of the plane and up the jet bridge. The humiliation didn't end there. Terminal 4 was packed with thousands of passengers waiting for their evening flights. As Richard was paraded through the concourse in handcuffs, a red-faced, sweating mess, hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto him. Smartphones immediately popped up into the air, camera lenses zoomed in. The CEO of Sterling Logistics was being treated like a common criminal, and the world was watching. Back on the plane, the heavy first-class cabin door finally swung shut. A collective sigh of relief washed over the remaining passengers. Samantha Higgins walked over to Suite 1A, a genuine, watery smile on her face. Dr. Caldwell, I don't even know what to say. Thank you. Josephine offered a warm, empathetic smile. You handled yourself beautifully, Samantha. Never let anyone speak to you like that, not on my watch. By the time Oceanic Airlines Flight 408 touched down smoothly on the tarmac at London Heathrow, the world had fundamentally changed for Richard Sterling. He just didn't know the full extent of it yet. Richard had spent the night in a grim Port Authority holding cell in Queens, New York. His expensive suit was wrinkled, he smelled of stale sweat, and his throat was raw from screaming at his lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, over his one allowed phone call. After posting a hefty bail for creating a public disturbance and resisting arrest, Richard was finally released into the brisk New York morning. He retrieved his belongings, powered on his smartphone, and the device immediately began vibrating so violently it nearly slipped from his hands. He had 94 missed calls, over 300 text messages, and a flood of urgent emails from his executive board. Frowning, Richard tapped on a text from his PR director, Greg Harrison. Greg, Richard, where are you? You need to call me right now. Do not speak to the press. Do not look at Twitter. We have a massive crisis. Richard's stomach dropped. He opened his web browser and went straight to a major news aggregator. He didn't even have to scroll. Taking up the entire front page was a massive headline. Do you know who I am? Racist logistics CEO. Humiliated by black neurosurgeon who owns the airplane. No. Richard whispered, leaning against a concrete pillar outside the precinct. Sarah Jenkins, the passenger sitting in Suite 2A behind Josephine, was a documentary filmmaker. Not only had she witnessed the entire interaction, but she had subtly propped her phone up against her window frame, recording the ordeal in crisp, 4K resolution with crystal clear audio. The video had been posted to YouTube and X, formerly Twitter, just minutes after the flight took off. By the time Richard was released from jail, the video had amassed over 40 million views. Richard pressed play on the embedded video. He watched, horrified, as his own voice boomed out of his phone's speaker. I don't know how she got in here. Whether she used thousands of stolen air miles or got some charity upgrade. Look at her. She looks like a vagrant off the street. The footage captured his sneer, his aggressive posturing, and his blatant threats to Samantha's job. But the true viral moment, the part the internet had clipped, remixed, and shared millions of times, was the look on his face when Josephine Caldwell stood up and calmly presented her Platinum Board of Directors card. The camera zoomed in perfectly on Richard's soul, leaving his body when Josephine delivered the killing blow. You have exactly 30 seconds to get off my aircraft. The internet was merciless. Social media sleuths had identified Richard within minutes. They found his LinkedIn, his company website, and his corporate partners. The hashtag number Sterling Logistics Racist was the #1 trending topic globally. His phone rang in his hand. It was Arthur Pendleton, his lawyer and the chairman of the board for Sterling Logistics. Arthur, Richard answered, his voice trembling. Arthur, we have to sue. We have to sue the airline. We have to sue that woman. We have to sue whoever posted that video. This is a targeted defamation campaign. Are you completely out of your mind? Arthur screamed through the receiver. The older man was furious. Defamation requires the statement to be false. Richard, you are on high-definition video, acting like a 1950s segregationist. Do you have any idea what you've done? I was stressed. I made a mistake. You made a fatal error, Arthur corrected coldly. I'm calling to inform you of the board's emergency meeting that concluded 10 minutes ago. Oceanic Airlines released a public statement at 6 a.m. Richard felt the blood rush to his ears. What did they say? They invoked the morals clause in our vendor contract. Oceanic Airlines has severed all ties with Sterling Logistics, effective immediately. They are pulling all their ground freight contracts globally. Do you understand what that means, Richard? Oceanic was 40% of our annual revenue. 40%. Gone, overnight. They can't do that, Richard shouted, pacing wildly on the sidewalk. We have an ironclad contract. I'll take them to federal court. I'll tie them up in litigation for a decade. With what money? Arthur yelled back. 3 of our other major clients, Global Tech, Horizon Shipping, and Apex Retail, saw the Oceanic statement. They just called me. They're dropping us too. No one wants their brand associated with a viral racist. Your face is toxic. Your name is a liability. Richard stopped pacing. The concrete beneath his feet felt like it was tilting. The empire he had spent 30 years building through ruthlessness and intimidation was crumbling into dust in a matter of hours, all because he couldn't stand the sight of a black woman sitting across from him in first class. "Arthur, what do we do?" Richard asked, his voice shrinking to a pathetic whisper. "I am stepping in as interim CEO," Arthur said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "The board has voted unanimously. You are officially terminated, Richard. You are no longer employed by Sterling Logistics. Do not come to the building. We are boxing up your office. If you try to enter the premises, security will have you arrested for trespassing. And frankly, considering you already have a mugshot from last night, I don't think you want to risk it." The line went dead. Richard stood alone on the bustling New York sidewalk, the morning sun glaring in his eyes. He had nothing. No company. No reputation. No power. The karma he had scoffed at his entire life had finally arrived, and it hadn't just knocked on his door, it had kicked it off the hinges. While Richard Sterling's corporate empire was actively burning to the ground on the mercilessly public streets of New York, Dr. Josephine Caldwell was experiencing a vastly different morning. She sat in serene, undisturbed quiet, enjoying a perfectly brewed cup of Earl Grey tea in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom on the 35th floor of the Shard. Below her, the sprawling, historic expanse of London stretched out as far as the eye could see, the River Thames cutting a winding, glittering path through the morning mist. Josephine took a slow, centering breath, letting the delicate aroma of bergamot wash over her. She had arrived in the city feeling surprisingly fresh, deeply rested after a full 7 hours of sleep in her first-class suite, and entirely ready to finalize the most significant, life-altering professional milestone of her entire career. She was no longer wearing the oversized charcoal cashmere hoodie and worn-in running shoes that had so deeply offended Richard Sterling. Today, she was dressed in her armor, a fiercely tailored, deep emerald green power suit that struck the perfect balance between high-fashion elegance and commanding authority. Her hair was pulled back into a flawless, sleek chignon. She looked exactly like the billionaire airline executive and world-class surgeon she was. Josephine was not just sitting in this boardroom to sign a standard business contract. She was the spearhead of a revolutionary, world-first medical initiative. Her elite hospital network in New York was partnering with the highly prestigious Royal Thames Medical Consortium. Together, they were building a transatlantic bridge to share highly sensitive, experimental neurosurgical equipment, groundbreaking pediatric research, and fragile biological transports between the United States and the United Kingdom. It was a multi-billion-dollar venture designed to save the lives of children suffering from previously inoperable brain tumors. The stakes could not possibly be higher. Moving experimental robotic surgical arms and temperature-sensitive stem cells across an ocean required a flawless, impenetrable, and absolutely pristine logistical network. There was zero room for error and zero tolerance for incompetence. The heavy, frosted glass door to the boardroom swung open, and Lord Edward Cromwell swept into the room, followed closely by his elite team of executives. Edward was the formidable, aristocratic head of the Royal Thames Consortium, a man with silver hair, sharp, intelligent eyes, and a reputation for being as ruthless in business as he was passionate about medical advancement. "Josephine, my dear," Edward greeted warmly, extending his hand as she stood to meet him. "It is wonderful to see you. Your flight was comfortable, I trust?" I heard a whisper from the Heathrow port authorities that there was a minor disturbance on Oceanic 408 upon your arrival. Josephine offered a serene, entirely unbothered smile, gracefully retaking her seat at the sprawling mahogany table. She didn't miss a beat. "Nothing my crew couldn't handle. Edward, just a passenger who forgot that a first-class ticket doesn't buy you the right to leave your basic human decency on the tarmac." Edward chuckled, a rich, appreciative sound, and shook his head as he adjusted his tortoiseshell spectacles. "Well said, as always. You Americans certainly know how to keep your customer service eventful. Now, to business." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from polite banter to high-stakes execution. Edward's team distributed thick, meticulously organized binders to everyone at the table. "We have finalized the core medical protocols on our end, and the government funding from the UK side is fully locked and held in escrow," Edward began, tapping a gold pen against his notepad. The final puzzle piece, the absolute linchpin of this entire operation, is the transatlantic freight partnership. We need a logistics company with an impeccable, bulletproof track record. We need a firm that can seamlessly interface with the Oceanic Airlines cargo manifests without a single dropped communication. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a separate, thick, glossy dossier across the polished wood table directly toward Josephine. My team has spent the last 6 months vetting dozens of top-tier international firms, Edward continued, pointing to the folder. We've found the perfect candidate. They specialize in heavy, sensitive freight. They already have a working, pre-established relationship with Oceanic Airlines ground teams, and they were supposed to send their chief executive here today to pitch us in person. Edward sighed, a hint of aristocratic annoyance coloring his tone. Unfortunately, we received an urgent, rather chaotic word an hour ago that their CEO had a sudden personal emergency and was abruptly terminated by his board of directors in the middle of the night. However, their new interim CEO, a Mr. Arthur Pendleton, is absolutely begging to take the meeting via secure video link. He assures us the company's operational capacity is unaffected. The company is called Sterling Logistics. Josephine sat perfectly still. She stared down at the glossy folder resting inches from her hands. Etched onto the center of the dark navy cover was an embossed silver letter, S. The universe, it seemed, possessed a profound, merciless, and breathtakingly precise sense of humor. The pieces clicked together in Josephine's brilliant mind with the speed of a supercomputer. Richard Sterling hadn't just been flying to London for a random, run-of-the-mill business meeting. He had been flying to pitch her partnership. The massive contract he had screamed about losing while standing in the aisle of her airplane, the very contract that was meant to save his struggling company, was the contract Josephine was currently sitting in London to sign. He had verbally assaulted the exact woman who held the literal keys to his kingdom. Josephine didn't laugh, but a cold, razor-sharp light danced in her dark, perceptive eyes. A terrifyingly calm stillness washed over her. "Is that so?" Josephine murmured, her voice smooth as glass, betraying absolutely none of the explosive revelation she had just experienced. "By all means, Edward, let's patch Mr. Pendleton through. I would love to hear this pitch." Edward nodded, completely unaware of the invisible guillotine hovering over the boardroom table. He signaled to his lead technical assistant, who quickly activated the massive, high-definition flat-screen monitor mounted at the far end of the room. A moment later, the screen flickered to life. The stressed, exhausted, and deeply panicked face of Arthur Pendleton appeared. He was sitting in Richard's old corner office in New York. Even through the digital compression of the video link, Arthur looked like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship. He was visibly sweating, his tie was slightly askew, and he had the hollow, haunted eyes of an executive who hadn't slept a single second since the scandal broke across the internet a few hours ago. "Lord Cromwell, thank you. Thank you so much for accommodating this remote setup given the unprecedented and highly unusual circumstances our firm is currently navigating." Arthur began, his voice tight, rapid, and vibrating with poorly concealed anxiety. "Not a problem at all, Arthur," Edward replied politely, leaning back in his leather chair. "We understand that corporate restructuring can happen rapidly. I believe you already know my medical team, but allow me to introduce our primary American partner. She is the principal visionary behind this initiative, and the vice chairwoman of Oceanic Airlines, who holds the final, unilateral veto power on this logistics contract." Edward gestured gracefully toward the other side of the table. The automated camera mounted on top of the screen whirred softly, panning across the expansive boardroom until it settled directly, perfectly, on Josephine Caldwell. On the video screen, Arthur Pendleton stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Arthur leaned closer to his webcam, his eyes widening in a display of absolute, unadulterated horror. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished ghost. He recognized her instantly. Every executive in America had seen the viral video by now. He was staring directly at the brilliant black neurosurgeon his former CEO had called a vagrant and tried to have physically thrown off a plane just hours earlier. Dr. Caldwell," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking violently. He swallowed hard, looking as though he might physically be ill. I didn't realize you were the principal partner on the Royal Thames project. Good morning, Mr. Pendleton, Josephine said. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the smooth, chillingly polite cadence of a surgeon holding a very sharp scalpel. I understand Sterling Logistics has had a rather turbulent morning. I also understand you are here to ask us to entrust you with $1 billion, highly sensitive medical supply chain. A supply chain meant to save children's lives. Arthur reached up with a trembling hand to wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead. Dr. Caldwell, please. I want to personally, deeply apologize on behalf of the entire executive board for the abhorrent, inexcusable actions of Richard Sterling. He has been completely, permanently removed from the company. We are a firm of integrity, doctor. We have thousands of hardworking employees, and we are still perfectly equipped to handle this contract. Please, do not let the actions of one man define us. Josephine leaned forward slowly, resting her forearms on the table and clasping her hands together. Her gaze was piercing, pinning Arthur to his seat through the digital screen. Integrity trickles down from leadership, Arthur, Josephine stated, her tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate or negotiation. Richard Sterling didn't act out of character yesterday. He acted out of a deeply ingrained, toxic sense of entitlement that your board actively tolerated, right up until the exact moment it became a public relations liability. You didn't fire him because he was racist, Arthur. You fired him because he got caught on camera. Arthur opened his mouth to protest, a desperate, gasping breath escaping his lips, but no words came out. There was no defense. He knew she was entirely correct. Sterling Logistics is a liability, Josephine continued, delivering the final, fatal blow with flawless, surgical precision. We are dealing with pediatric healthcare. We demand excellence, and we demand humanity. Your firm possesses neither. Oceanic Airlines has already severed all contracts with your firm globally, and as the managing partner of this medical venture, I am officially vetoing your bid. Your company will never touch a single piece of freight associated with my hospital, my airline, or my partners ever again. This meeting is over. Good luck with your public relations, Mr. Pendleton. Without waiting for a response, Josephine reached out across the table and firmly pressed the glowing red disconnect button on the console. The screen instantly went black, cutting off Arthur's panicked, pleading face. The London boardroom plunged into a stunned, breathless silence. The British executives stared at the blank screen, trying to process the absolute, devastating corporate execution they had just witnessed. Slowly, Lord Edward Cromwell turned his head to look at Josephine. A slow, deeply impressed, and slightly terrified smile began to spread across his aristocratic face. I take it, Edward murmured, raising an eyebrow, that Sterling Logistics was the minor disturbance on your flight? They were, Josephine replied calmly, picking up her delicate porcelain teacup and taking a final, satisfying sip of her Earl Grey. She looked out the window at the sprawling, infinite possibilities of the city below. But they won't be disturbing anyone ever again. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled. But the wreckage of Richard Sterling's life was absolute, scattered across the corporate landscape like debris from a catastrophic wreck. The sheer velocity of his downfall had left him with permanent whiplash. Sterling Logistics, the empire he had spent 3 decades building, with ruthless intimidation and cutthroat tactics, had hemorrhaged clients so rapidly following the viral video that the board had no choice but to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was a humiliating, protracted death broadcasted on every financial news network in the country. But the universe wasn't finished extracting its toll. In a move of brilliant, surgical corporate strategy, Oceanic Airlines' internal cargo division swooped in like a bird of prey. They purchased Sterling's remaining viable assets, its massive storage warehouses, and its fleet of transport vehicles for literal pennies on the dollar during the liquidation sale. Oceanic effectively absorbed the smoking ruins of Richard's life's work to expand their own global operations, turning his monumental failure into their unprecedented quarterly profit. Because Richard had been terminated strictly under the morals clause of his ironclad executive contract, his coveted golden parachute was entirely voided. He lost his stock options, his multi-million-dollar severance package, and his lavish corporate perks. His sprawling Manhattan penthouse had to be listed on the market just to cover the mounting legal fees from lawsuits filed by furious shareholders. He was relegated to a rented townhouse in the suburbs, spending his agonizingly long days pacing the hardwood floors in absolute silence. His phone, which used to ring incessantly with politicians, CEOs, and sycophants begging for his favor, had gone completely dead. Desperate to maintain some fleeting semblance of his former elite status, Richard tried to seek refuge in his social circles. On a crisp, cloudless Tuesday afternoon, he drove his leased Mercedes, a far cry from his former chauffeur-driven Maybach, to the heavily gated, ivy-covered entrance of the Oakbridge Country Club in Connecticut. This was the pinnacle of old money and power, the very club where he had arrogantly claimed to play golf with the elite. He convinced himself that if he could just get inside, if he could just buy a few rounds of scotch in the mahogany-paneled lounge and press a few hands, he could network his way out of this nightmare. He could explain that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He pulled up to the security kiosk, rolling down his window and expecting the guard to wave him through with a deferential nod, just as he had for the past 15 years. Instead, the guard, a burly, unsmiling man named Thomas, stepped out of the booth holding a clipboard. He didn't reach for the gate controls. His expression was a wall of granite. "Afternoon, Mr. Sterling. I'm going to have to ask you to turn your vehicle around," Thomas said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of the respect Richard felt he was owed. Richard's face instantly flushed with a familiar toxic anger. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the leather steering wheel. "Excuse me? I've been a member here for 15 years. I pay $50,000 a year in dues." "Open the gate, Thomas." "My apologies, sir, but your membership was officially revoked by the club's board of directors late last night," Thomas replied, not taking a single step back from the car. "I have strict instructions from the top not to let you on the property under any circumstances." "Revoked? On whose authority?" Richard yelled, slamming his open hand aggressively against his steering wheel. The loud smack echoed in the quiet, manicured driveway. "I demand to speak to the club president right now." "On mine, Richard." Richard whipped his head around. Walking down the pristine, tree-lined, paved driveway from the grand clubhouse was William Hastings. Bill was a towering, affable man with a booming laugh who happened to be the sitting CEO of Oceanic Airlines. He also held the prestigious title of president of the Oakbridge Country Club. Richard felt a desperate surge of hope. He practically threw the car into park and leaned his head out the window. "Bill, thank God," Richard pleaded, completely missing the freezing hostility radiating from the other man's eyes. "You have to tell this guard to let me in. We need to talk, just for 5 minutes. Your vice chairwoman, Dr. Caldwell. She completely destroyed my life over a ridiculous, blown out of proportion misunderstanding. The media twisted my words. I need you to help me fix this. We're both businessmen, Bill. You know how these things go." Bill Hastings stopped a few feet from the car. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He looked down at Richard as if he were scraping something utterly foul off the bottom of his Italian leather shoe. "Richard, you really are the most oblivious man I've ever met," Bill said, his voice dropping an octave, dripping with a profound, chilling disdain. "Dr. Caldwell didn't destroy your life. You did. You bullied her, you threatened her physical safety, you hurled racist insults at a woman simply sitting quietly in her seat, and you severely embarrassed my airline on a global stage. There was no misunderstanding. We all saw the high-definition video." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Bill raised a single, authoritative finger, silencing him instantly. "Josephine is one of my closest personal friends," Bill continued mercilessly, his gaze pinning Richard to his seat. "She is the godmother to my youngest daughter and the sharpest, most honorable mind on our board. When she called me from London and calmly told me what you did to her, I didn't just agree with her decision to drop your firm. I personally drafted the press release severing your company's contract. I celebrated when Oceanic bought your crumbling warehouses for a fraction of their worth." Richard stared at him, his mouth agape, his chest tightening painfully. The realization that he had completely fabricated his own safety net, that he had never truly belonged in these halls of power, was finally, brutally dawning on him. "You're radioactive, Richard," Bill said, leaning down slightly so his voice easily carried into the car. "You are a pariah. No one in this state wants to be seen within 100 yards of you. The club board held an emergency meeting last night, and we voted unanimously to kick you out and refund your dues." "You don't belong here anymore. Turn your car around, go back to wherever it is you're hiding, and don't ever come back to this club." Bill reached out, tapped the roof of Richard's car twice with a hollow, dismissive thud, turned his back, and walked calmly away up the driveway. Richard sat frozen in the idling car, the heavy V8 engine humming quietly beneath him. He was completely out of moves. He had no job, no company, no country club, no friends, and a name that was permanently synonymous with arrogant bigotry across the internet. A slow, suffocating panic set in. With trembling hands, he slowly put the car in reverse, backed out of the prestigious driveway, and drove away into the afternoon, entirely and utterly alone. Meanwhile, miles away in New York, the atmosphere couldn't have been more remarkably different. Back at JFK International Airport, Terminal 4 was buzzing with an electric, undeniable excitement. Dr. Josephine Caldwell stood confidently at a sleek acrylic podium positioned near Gate B12, the exact spot where the entire agonizing ordeal had begun 3 months prior. She was dressed impeccably, in a tailored, royal blue blazer and crisp trousers, looking every bit the powerhouse corporate executive and world-class surgeon she was. Behind her, visible through the massive, towering glass windows of the concourse, sat a breathtaking, brand-new Oceanic Airlines Boeing 787 Dreamliner, its freshly painted exterior gleaming brightly under the afternoon sun. The gate area was packed. Hundreds of people, including aviation journalists, airline staff, medical professionals, and local dignitaries, were gathered for a highly anticipated press conference. Standing proudly in the very front row, wiping a stray tear of joy from her eye, was Samantha Higgins. The former lead purser had recently been promoted to Director of In-Flight Customer Relations by Josephine herself, a position where she now trained thousands of crew members on conflict de-escalation, bias training, and passenger dignity. Josephine adjusted the microphone. When she looked out at the sea of smiling faces, she didn't see the ghost of the angry, bitter man who had tried to tear her down. She saw the bright, unyielding future she was actively forging. "Today, we are not just christening a new aircraft." Josephine spoke into the microphone, her calm, measured voice echoing clearly and powerfully across the vast terminal. "We are launching a new, permanent initiative for this company. Oceanic Airlines is incredibly proud to announce the creation of a $50 million endowment foundation. This fund is dedicated strictly to providing full-ride, comprehensive scholarships for minority women pursuing highly specialized careers in both commercial aviation and pediatric neurosurgery." The crowd erupted. The thunderous applause bounced off the high ceilings, accompanied by the rapid, blinding flashes of dozens of press cameras. Samantha cheered loudly from the front row, beaming with uncontainable pride as she clapped her hands. Josephine held up a hand, gracefully allowing the applause to gently fade before she continued. A subtle, deeply knowing smirk played on her lips, a quiet acknowledgement of the poetic justice that had fully funded this very moment. "We are funding this foundation entirely using the capital saved from restructuring our ground logistics network over the past quarter," Josephine continued, her eyes sparkling with fierce, unapologetic intelligence. "Because true power isn't about tearing people down to make yourself feel big. It is not found in intimidation or unearned entitlement. True power is about building structures that lift others up. It is about clearing the runway for the next generation of brilliant minds who just need a fair chance to take flight." She stepped out from behind the podium, turning elegantly and gesturing toward the massive, magnificent airplane sitting on the sunlit tarmac. Painted proudly in sweeping script on the side of the fuselage, right beneath the gleaming cockpit window, was the name of the new aircraft. The Bessie Coleman, named in distinct honor of the first African-American woman to hold a pilot's license. Josephine looked out at the crowd, her head held high, the heavy weight of the past 3 months entirely lifted from her shoulders. She hadn't just defeated a bully. She had systematically dismantled his legacy of prejudice and used the financial scraps to build a tangible, enduring future for thousands of young women who looked exactly like her. The universe had delivered its karma with devastating precision, and Josephine Caldwell had confidently signed the receipt, turning one man's hatred into a legacy of undeniable hope. Can you believe the absolute audacity of that man? He thought his wealth made him invincible, but he picked a fight with the literal owner of the airplane. That is what I call a masterclass in instant karma. Dr. Josephine Caldwell didn't just put him in his place. She dismantled his entire corporate empire and used his lost millions to fund scholarships for minority women. Talk about poetic justice. If this story of brutal revenge and ultimate triumph got your blood pumping, smash that like button right now. Have you ever witnessed someone's arrogance blow up in their face this spectacularly? Drop your craziest karma stories in the comments down below. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another unbelievable true life drama. See you in the next video.